Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship, looking at the strange message that had just arrived from deep space. The blue lights from the control panels cast shadows across his face as he read the words that would change everything for humanity. His ship, the UES Defiance, was one of Earth's newest and strongest vessels, but even Jake knew it was nothing compared to what was out there in the galaxy. The message came from something called the Galactic Defense Council, and it was written in perfect English, which made Jake wonder how these aliens knew their language so well. Lieutenant Amy Parker walked up to him holding a data pad with more information about the message. She was young but smart, and Jake trusted her to figure out the technical parts of alien communication. That made his head hurt. Amy looked worried as she spoke to her commander about what the message really meant for Earth and all the people living there. The aliens were inviting humans to join something called the Trial of Worthiness, which sounded like a test that could either make Earth part of a big galactic community or leave them alone and defenseless against hostile forces that might want to hurt them. Jake read the message again and realized that this trial was not going to be easy for any species that tried it. The aliens had built a special place called the Nexus Proving Grounds where different species would command fleets of ships and fight against computer-controlled enemies in scenarios designed to test every aspect of military thinking and survival skills. Captain Lisa Chang appeared on the communication screen from her ship, the UES Thunderbolt, which was smaller and faster than Jake's vessel, but just as deadly in the right hands. Lisa had been Jake's friend for many years, and he valued her opinion about military matters more than almost anyone else in the human fleet. She told Jake that their intelligence people had been studying the message and found some worrying things about what the aliens really wanted from this trial. Lisa explained that some of the alien species in the Galactic Defense Council saw humans as dangerous newcomers who might cause trouble if they became too powerful too quickly. The trial was partly a test of human abilities, but it was also a way for the aliens to see if humans could be trusted with advanced technology and membership in their galactic community. The human delegation for this trial would be small but carefully chosen to represent the best of Earth's military thinking and technological capability. Jake would command the heavy cruiser Defiance with its powerful weapons and strong armor. Lisa would take the fast attack vessel Thunderbolt with its advanced sensors and quick strike capability. Captain Rick Torres would command the support ship UES Guardian, which carried supplies, medical equipment, and backup systems for the other two vessels. All three ships had been modified with standard Galactic Council technology to make the trial fair for all species participating. This meant that humans could not use their own advanced weapons or defensive systems, but had to rely on alien equipment that worked differently from anything Earth had ever built. Jake wondered if this would give them a disadvantage against species that had been using this technology for thousands of years. As the three human ships traveled toward the Nexus system, Jake could see other alien fleets arriving at the same destination. Some ships looked like nothing he had ever imagined, with strange shapes and colors that seemed to change as he watched them. Other vessels were so different from human designs that Jake could not even figure out which end was the front and which was the back. Dr. Helen Brooks was the mission's expert on alien life forms, and she spent hours studying the other ships through the Defiance's sensors, trying to understand what kinds of beings they would be competing against. She told Jake that each species probably had completely different ways of thinking about warfare and military tactics, which would make the trial even more challenging for humans who only knew how to fight other humans. Lieutenant Colonel Sam Hughes was responsible for planning human strategy during the trial, and he was already worried about what they might face. Sam had studied every human military conflict in history, and he knew that humans were good at adapting to new situations, but they had never faced anything like a galactic-level military trial against species with thousands of years more experience in space warfare. The Nexus system looked artificial when they finally arrived, with massive space stations arranged in perfect geometric patterns around a central command hub. Jake could see that each participating species had been given their own area to set up command centers and prepare for the trials. Some aliens had built structures that looked like giant insect hives, while others seemed to exist inside containers filled with glowing gas or liquid. Jake realized that this trial was going to test more than just human military skills. They would have to prove that humans could work with alien technology understand alien ways of thinking, and survive against threats that no human had ever imagined. The stakes could not be higher because failure might mean that Earth would remain isolated and vulnerable, while success could open up a galaxy full of new possibilities and new dangers. As Jake prepared his crew for what was coming, he thought about all the people back on Earth who were counting on them to succeed. The trial would begin soon, and there would be no second chances for any species that failed to prove themselves worthy of joining the galactic community. The meeting hall on Nexus Prime was bigger than anything Jake had ever seen, with a curved ceiling that seemed to go up forever and walls made of some kind of material that changed colors as different aliens moved around the room. Jake walked slowly with his small human delegation, trying not to stare too obviously at the incredible variety of alien life forms that had gathered for the trial ceremony. Supreme Admiral Zethka was a tall reptilian being who wore elaborate armor, covered in symbols that probably meant something important to his species. When he spoke, his words were translated by machines into perfect English, but Jake could hear the strange clicking and hissing sounds of the original alien language underneath the translation. The alien leader's voice filled the enormous hall as he explained what the trials would test and why they were necessary for any species wanting to join the galactic community. Dr. Helen Brooks stood near Jake, taking careful notes about each alien species she could see in the Great Hall. She whispered to Jake about the different types of beings they would be competing against and what she could guess about their possible strengths and weaknesses based on their physical appearance and behavior. Some aliens looked like they would be naturally good at working together in groups, while others seemed more suited to individual combat or technical problem-solving. The Zakari looked like giant insects with multiple arms and legs that moved in perfect coordination with each other. Helen explained that they probably had some kind of group mind that let them work together without needing to talk or send signals to coordinate their actions. This would make them very dangerous in any situation that required quick teamwork and precise timing. The Threnodi had bodies that seemed to be made of living crystal that sparkled and reflected light in beautiful patterns. They moved very slowly and deliberately, which made Jake think they might be very careful planners who thought about every decision for a long time before acting. Their crystal bodies probably made them very tough and hard to damage, but also heavy and slow to change direction quickly. The Krovar were the most frightening aliens in the hall, with black armor that covered them completely, so nobody could see what they really looked like underneath. They stood perfectly still and silent in their section of the hall, and other alien species seemed to stay far away from them. Helen told Jake that the Krovar had a reputation throughout the galaxy for being incredibly violent and effective, warriors who showed no mercy to their enemies. The gaseous Etherians existed inside special suits that contained their cloud-like bodies and let them interact with solid matter. Jake watched as they communicated with each other through patterns of colored lights that flowed across the surface of their containment suits. They seemed to be constantly moving and shifting even when they were trying to stand still, which made Jake wonder how they could operate solid machinery or weapons effectively. Supreme Admiral Zethka began explaining the 5 different trials that would test each species in areas that the Galactic Defense Council considered essential for membership. The first trial would test basic military tactics and fleet coordination under overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The second would challenge species to adapt to unexpected technological problems. The third would measure diplomatic and strategic thinking under pressure. The fourth would test moral flexibility when forced to choose between different types of victory. The fifth and final trial was designed to break even the strongest military traditions and see how each species faced impossible odds. Lieutenant Colonel Sam Hughes listened carefully to every word of the explanation while trying to figure out what kinds of strategies might work against the different challenges they would face. He was worried that the trials had been designed by aliens who thought about warfare in completely different ways than humans, and that traditional human military tactics might not work at all in these artificial scenarios. The first trial began immediately after the ceremony ended, with each species taking command of identical fleets of 20 standardized warships. Jake found himself on the bridge of a ship that looked and felt nothing like any human vessel he had ever commanded. The controls were in different places. The weapons worked on principles he did not understand. And even the way the ship moved through space felt strange and unfamiliar. Amy Parker struggled with the alien tactical systems, trying to figure out how to coordinate their 20 Ships against the 100 enemy vessels they could see approaching on the sensors. The enemy ships were controlled by advanced computer programs that had been designed to fight, using the best tactics and strategies from dozens of different alien civilizations. This meant that the enemy would be unpredictable and extremely dangerous, even though they were not real living beings. Jake watched as other species began their attacks using traditional military formations and strategies that had probably worked for their civilizations for thousands of years. The Zakari used swarm tactics with all their ships moving together like a single organism. The Threnodi formed defensive walls designed to protect their most important vessels while wearing down the enemy through careful, long-range attacks. The Krovar did exactly what Jake expected them to do by charging straight at the enemy in a brutal frontal assault that relied on superior firepower and heavy armor to smash through enemy defenses. They lost many ships quickly, but they also destroyed enemy vessels faster than any other species Jake could see on the tactical displays. Most of the alien species were losing between 60 and 80% of their ships before they managed to complete their victory conditions and win the first trial. Jake realized that the trial was designed to be extremely difficult, and that even species with thousands of years of military experience were struggling to find effective solutions to the tactical problems they faced. Captain Lisa Chang called Jake from the Thunderbolt to discuss their strategy for the first trial. She pointed out that all the other species were using conventional military tactics that the enemy computer programs had probably been designed to counter effectively. Lisa suggested that humans might have an advantage if they could find completely different approaches that the enemy would not expect or understand. Jake made a decision that would change everything for the human fleet and possibly determine whether Earth would join the galactic community or remain isolated and vulnerable to future threats from hostile alien civilizations. Jake Morrison made a decision that shocked every alien observer watching the human fleet during the first trial. Instead of forming battle lines or defensive positions like every other species had done, Jake ordered his 20 ships to scatter in completely different directions as if they were running away from the fight. The alien military experts watching from the observation stations began making comments about human cowardice and lack of military discipline. Amy Parker felt confused by Jake's orders, but she trusted her commander enough to follow them even when they seemed to make no sense from a traditional military perspective. She watched her tactical display as the human ships spread out across a huge area of space with no apparent pattern or coordination between them. The enemy fleet of 100 ships began chasing individual human vessels instead of fighting against an organized formation. Captain Lisa Chang understood what Jake was trying to do before anyone else, and she began implementing hit-and-run attacks against enemy ships that were isolated from their main force. Her fast ship, the Thunderbolt, would appear suddenly near an enemy vessel, fire all its weapons, and then disappear before the enemy could respond effectively. This was not the kind of honorable fleet combat that most alien species preferred, but it was working better than conventional tactics. When Rick Torres used his support ship, the Guardian, in ways that the alien observers had never seen before. Instead of staying safely behind the battle lines providing supplies and repairs, Rick began deploying improvised mines made from modified reactor components. These weapons were not very sophisticated, but they were completely unexpected, and the enemy ships did not have programming to deal with such unconventional threats. Dr. Helen Brooks discovered something important about the enemy fleet while studying their movement patterns and attack strategies. The computer programs controlling the enemy ships had been designed to fight against predictable military tactics used by civilized galactic species. The enemy could anticipate and counter almost any conventional strategy, but they could not adapt to completely random or irrational behavior. Jake realized that humans had an advantage that no other species possessed. Most alien civilizations had developed formal military traditions over thousands of years, and their warriors thought about combat in organized, systematic ways. Humans had evolved on a dangerous planet where survival often depended on creative problem-solving and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Sam Hughes began coordinating what he called constructive chaos among the human ships. They would pretend to retreat and then suddenly attack from unexpected directions. They used damaged ships as decoys to draw enemy forces into traps. They even launched empty cargo containers at high speed to ram into enemy vessels, causing confusion and minor damage that disrupted enemy formations. The most shocking thing about human tactics was their willingness to sacrifice individual ships to achieve larger strategic goals. Other alien species tried to preserve all their vessels because each ship represented years of construction time and valuable resources. Humans seemed to view their ships as tools that could be expended if it would help them win the overall battle. Amy Parker coordinated a complex deception operation that made the enemy think the human fleet was much larger than it actually was. She used sensor ghosts and false signals to create the appearance of additional ships in locations where no human vessels existed. The enemy fleet began splitting its forces to respond to these phantom threats, which made them vulnerable to attacks from the real human ships. Jake watched as other alien species continued to lose most of their fleets using traditional military strategies. The honor-bound Threnody refused to use tactics they considered dishonorable, even when such tactics might save their ships. The systematic Zakari could not break away from their swarm coordination patterns even when those patterns were being countered effectively by enemy programming. The Crover were more successful than most species because their brutal approach was at least unpredictable in its intensity, but even they were losing ships faster than they could destroy enemy vessels. The Crover General Thakgor was heard commenting that humans fought like prey, animals that had forgotten they were supposed to be afraid of predators. Captain Chang discovered that the enemy command ship was the key to the entire fleet and that capturing it instead of destroying it would immediately end the battle with a human victory. This was not something that most alien species would attempt because boarding enemy vessels was considered extremely risky and usually resulted in heavy casualties for the attacking force. Jake made another decision that surprised everyone, including his own crew members. Instead of trying to destroy the enemy fleet through conventional combat, the humans would attempt to capture the command ship using boarding pods and small craft. This strategy had not been used in galactic warfare for centuries because most species considered it too dangerous and unpredictable. Rick Torres modified his support ship to launch improvised boarding pods made from cargo containers equipped with basic life support systems. These were not sophisticated military assault vehicles, but they were small enough to avoid most enemy weapons and tough enough to survive impact with the enemy. Command ship. Lisa Chang used her fast ship to distract the enemy fleet while Jake's heavier ship moved into position for the boarding assault. The enemy ships were programmed to respond to conventional fleet threats, and they could not adapt quickly enough to deal with the strange combination of deception, ramming attacks, and boarding operations that humans were using. The boarding operation succeeded when human Marines captured the enemy command ship and used its own weapon systems against the remaining enemy fleet. This victory was achieved with only 30% casualties among human ships, which was the lowest loss rate of any surviving species. In the first trial, Supreme Admiral Zeth Ka requested detailed reports about human tactical procedures because the alien military experts could not understand how humans had achieved victory using methods that violated most accepted principles of civilized warfare. The other species began paying much closer attention to human operations as they realized these newcomers might be more dangerous than anyone had expected. Jake Morrison stood on his bridge looking at the results of the first trial and wondering what the next challenge would bring for his small human fleet. The aliens had seen that humans could survive and win under impossible odds, but Jake knew the trials would become much more difficult as they continued. The fourth trial was designed to break the moral foundations that most civilized species use to guide their military decisions during times of war. Jake Morrison found himself commanding his fleet in a scenario where they had to protect civilian evacuation ships while fighting against enemy forces that could only be defeated through tactics that would result in the deaths of innocent people, including families and children. Supreme Admiral Zeth Ka had explained that this trial would test whether species could make the hard decisions necessary for galactic defense, even when those decisions violated their deepest moral beliefs. The scenario was carefully crafted to force each species to choose between achieving military victory and preserving their humanitarian principles. Dr. Helen Brooks studied the tactical situation and realized that the enemy fleet had positioned itself so that any effective attack would destroy at least 3 civilian ships. carrying more than 15,000 refugees. The enemy knew that most civilized species would hesitate to sacrifice innocent lives even if it meant losing the battle and allowing even greater numbers of civilians to die later. Jake watched as other species approached this moral dilemma, according to their different cultural values and military traditions. The honor-bound Threnody immediately refused to use any tactics that would harm civilians, and they accepted military defeat rather than compromise their principles. Their commander stated that victory achieved through the murder of innocents was not victory at all, but rather the first step toward becoming the very evil they were supposed to fight against. The practical Vorthon Empire calculated acceptable casualty ratios and implemented strategies designed to minimize civilian deaths while still achieving their military objectives. They destroyed 2 civilian ships containing 8,000 refugees in order to create an opening that allowed them to defeat the enemy and save the remaining 40,000 civilians. Their commander justified this decision by pointing out that doing nothing would result in all the civilians dying anyway. The Krovar showed no hesitation at all in using civilian ships as shields and weapons against their enemies. They deliberately rammed civilian vessels into enemy positions and used the confusion and debris to launch devastating attacks that quickly destroyed the opposing fleet. The Krovar commander explained that the civilians were going to die regardless of what anyone did, so their deaths might as well serve a useful military purpose. Jake faced the same impossible choice that had already destroyed or compromised every other species in the trial. Standard military doctrine suggested that sacrificing 15,000 civilians to save 40,000 others was the correct tactical decision. Earth's military academies taught that commanders had to make such calculations during wartime even when the human cost was terrible to contemplate. Amy Parker worked with the ship's engineering teams to find alternative solutions that might avoid the need to choose between military victory and civilian protection. She believed that human creativity and technological adaptability might allow them to find options that other species had not considered possible within the constraints of the scenario. Dr. Brooks had an idea about modifying their sensor arrays to create false energy signatures that would make the enemy think the humans were preparing to attack civilian ships. If the enemy could be convinced to reposition their forces even slightly, it might create new tactical opportunities that did not require civilian casualties. Captain Lisa Chang volunteered her ship, the Thunderbolt, for a deception operation that would involve pretending to suffer critical systems failures while broadcasting emergency signals, suggesting that her vessel was about to explode. The enemy fleet would probably move to avoid the expected reactor breach, and this might create gaps in their defensive formation. Captain Rick Torres prepared his support ship, the Guardian, to project holographic images of additional civilian vessels in positions where no real ships existed. This would confuse enemy targeting systems and create multiple false targets that might draw fire away from the actual civilian evacuation convoy. Jake realized that the humans were attempting something that the trial designers had considered mathematically impossible. Instead of choosing between military victory and civilian protection, they were trying to create a completely new alternative through technological innovation and tactical deception. The human solution required perfect timing and coordination between all 3 ships, plus a great deal of luck that their improvised technologies would work correctly under combat conditions. Jake knew that failure would mean not only military defeat, but also the deaths of all the civilians they were trying to protect. Lisa Chang began her false emergency broadcast while maneuvering her ship closer to the enemy formation. The enemy fleet detected what appeared to be an imminent reactor explosion and began moving to avoid the blast radius. This created exactly the opening that Jake needed to implement the rest of his plan. Rick Torres activated his holographic projection systems, and suddenly the sensor displays showed dozens of additional civilian ships scattered throughout the combat area. The enemy targeting computers could not distinguish between real and false targets, which meant their weapons were divided among many more potential threats than actually existed. Jake ordered his ship, the Defiance, to deploy modified mining charges in a pattern that would create an artificial asteroid field between the enemy fleet and the real civilian ships. The enemy would lose visual contact with their targets and would have to rely on sensors that were already confused by Rick's holographic deceptions. The combination of Lisa's false emergency, Rick's holographic projections, and Jake's artificial asteroid field created enough confusion and misdirection that the entire civilian convoy was able to escape to safety, while the human fleet achieved complete military victory against the enemy forces. Supreme Admiral Zethka requested an immediate review of all human tactical recordings because the alien military experts could not understand how the humans had solved a problem that was supposed to have no solution. The trial scenario had been tested against hundreds of different species over thousands of years, and no civilization had ever found a way to save all the civilians while still winning the military engagement. The alien observers began to realize that humans approached moral dilemmas differently than other species. Instead of accepting that some situations required choosing between different types of failure, humans seemed to believe that creative thinking and technological innovation could always find better alternatives if they refused to give up looking for them. Jake Morrison had proven that human military thinking was not just tactically unconventional but also morally innovative in ways that challenged the basic assumptions underlying galactic military doctrine. The fifth and final trial was designed as an elimination scenario where no species was expected to survive and victory was mathematically impossible according to every computer simulation the Galactic Defense Council had ever run. Jake Morrison found his small human fleet defending a critical space station against enemy forces that outnumbered them 50-1 and possessed superior technology, better weapons, and more experienced commanders. Only 5 species had survived the previous 4 trials, and each one faced the same hopeless situation with no possibility of retreat and no chance of receiving reinforcements. The Krovar, Skari, Vorthon Empire, Saurian Dominion, and humans were each given identical defensive positions around installations that could not be abandoned without failing the trial completely. Supreme Admiral Zethka explained that this final test was not about winning or losing, but about how different civilizations faced inevitable destruction while maintaining their military honor and discipline. The alien leaders wanted to see which species would fight bravely until the end and which would collapse into chaos when confronted with certain death. The Krovar were the first to be eliminated, despite their reputation for brutality and effectiveness in combat. They fought with their characteristic violence and determination, destroying as many enemy ships as possible before their own fleet was completely annihilated. Their commander sent a final message stating that they had died as warriors should die, in battle against overwhelming odds with weapons in their hands. The Zakari attempted to use their swarm intelligence and group coordination to find tactical solutions that individual thinking could not discover. They moved their ships in perfect formation and responded to threats with instantaneous precision that no other species could match. However, their coordinated approach made them predictable to enemy forces that had been designed to counter organized military strategies. The Vorthon Empire deployed the most advanced defensive technologies available to any galactic civilization, including energy shields that could absorb incredible amounts of damage and automated weapon systems that fired faster and more accurately than living beings could manage. Despite these advantages, they were slowly overwhelmed by sheer numbers and superior enemy firepower. The Saurian Dominion represented thousands of years of military tradition and formal strategic education. Their commanders were trained in every aspect of warfare, and their ships were operated by crews with generations of experience in space combat. They implemented textbook defensive strategies that should have maximized their survival time, but they still fell within 6 hours of the beginning of the engagement. The human fleet was expected to last no more than 4 hours based on their performance in previous trials and their limited experience with galactic-level warfare. Jake Morrison knew that conventional military tactics would not work against such overwhelming odds, and that humans would need to try something that had never been attempted in the history of galactic conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Sam Hughes proposed what he called Protocol Phoenix, a strategy that required every member of the human fleet to be willing to sacrifice their lives in ways that most species would consider completely insane. The plan involved deliberately destroying their own ships while using the wreckage and explosions as weapons against the enemy fleet. Jake realized that Protocol Phoenix would only work if the humans could coordinate their self-destruction in ways that created maximum damage to enemy forces, while still allowing some human personnel to survive and continue fighting from hidden positions. This would require technological modifications to their ships that had never been tested under combat conditions. Dr. Helen Brooks worked with engineering teams to modify the life support systems on all three human ships so they could launch concealed survival pods before the main vessels were destroyed. These pods would be too small for enemy sensors to detect easily, and they would contain enough supplies and equipment for extended survival in space. Captain Lisa Chang volunteered to be the first human commander to implement Protocol Phoenix by flying her ship the Thunderbolt directly into the center of the enemy formation while overloading her reactor core. The explosion would destroy dozens of enemy vessels while her crew escaped in hidden survival pods that would land on the space station they were defending. Captain Rick Torres prepared his support ship, the Guardian, for use as a massive kinetic weapon by accelerating it to near light speed. Before impact with the largest enemy vessel, the collision would create a chain reaction that would damage or destroy much of the enemy fleet while Rick and his crew evacuated to concealed positions from which they could continue fighting. Jake ordered his heavy cruiser, the Defiance, to be converted into what Amy Parker called a ghost ship that would continue operating even after the main crew had evacuated. The ship's computer systems would be programmed to fight independently while broadcasting false signals designed to convince the enemy that the human fleet was much larger than it actually was. The human implementation of Protocol Phoenix created chaos and confusion among enemy forces that had been programmed to fight against organized fleets and military formations. The enemy artificial intelligence could not adapt to the concept of military personnel, continuing to fight from small hidden positions after their primary vessels had been completely destroyed. Dr. Brooks had discovered that enemy targeting systems were designed to consider threats eliminated once their main ships were no longer operational. The enemy could not effectively hunt for small groups of survivors who refused to surrender and continued launching attacks from concealed locations using improvised weapons and salvaged equipment. The human survivors began what Lieutenant Parker called ghost warfare. From their hidden positions throughout the space station and surrounding area, they used captured enemy equipment to create false sensor readings, deployed improvised explosive devices, and coordinated surprise attacks against enemy supply lines and communication systems. The enemy fleet found itself fighting an opponent that should not have existed according to all their programming and tactical databases. They had overwhelming superiority in ships, weapons, and technology, but they could not locate or eliminate human survivors who seemed to appear anywhere at any time to launch devastating attacks before disappearing again. After 18 hours of ghost warfare, the human survivors had captured enough enemy equipment to begin launching coordinated strikes against critical command vessels in the enemy fleet. Their tactics were so unconventional that enemy artificial intelligence could not predict or counter them effectively, leading to increasing confusion and tactical uncertainty throughout the enemy forces. Supreme Admiral Zeth Ka called an emergency halt to the trial when it became clear that humans might actually achieve tactical victory from a position that had been designed to guarantee defeat for any species that attempted it. The alien observers could not understand how humans had survived when 4 other civilizations with superior military traditions had been completely eliminated. In the final ceremony, Jake Morrison stood before representatives of 12 alien civilizations as Supreme Admiral Zeth Ka announced that humanity had been accepted into the Galactic Defense Council with full membership and voting rights. Several species also requested formal military alliances because they recognized that human tactical innovations could reshape the future of galactic warfare.